Game over, man. Game over.
Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for November 22nd, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Yeah.
At least if you're listening on the day this episode goes live.
Yeah.
It is Thanksgiving. So we hope everyone is having a great day, or depending on the time you're listening to this, had a great day.
For sure. For sure.
And, spending time with your family, eating tons of food, watching the Lions win this year? Win, maybe?
8-3? 8-3, is that coming?
Who knows? I mean, they might keep the tradition going.
Yeah.
To me, this year is a win-win, right? I
Yeah,
talked about
yeah.
this on the main show this last week. That opening 20 minutes was a little bit of a doozy. Brendan and I did not plan that.
No,
but it was really fun.
that went very surprisingly long. We basically created a full segment without planning for a full segment there.
I know.
It was amazing.
Yes. And during that conversation, I talked about how I grew up in Michigan, and a huge part of family tradition for me, because the Lions are the worst professional sports franchise in North America.
Yeah. Never won a Super Bowl, right? They're one of the 12 teams that have never won a Super Bowl
Brendan,
yet, right?
They've never been past the first round of the playoffs, okay? They've only been
I was going to say, because I know that there are 12 teams that haven't won a Super Bowl, but then if you stretch that even thinner, how many haven't even gotten past that playoff line?
No.
Yeah.
The Lions are just historically one of the worst. At any rate, I say all of that to say a huge part of Thanksgiving for me, because they are somehow one of the teams that play on national TV every year, regardless of how awful they are. And so part of the fun is getting together with your family and eating and indulging and watching the Lions embarrass themselves on national TV. But those that follow the NFL may know, you'll see that the Lions are 8-2. They are not bad. In fact, they're massive contenders at the moment.
That's why I said 8-3. Are they keeping traditional? Actually, I mean, even if they do lose, you make a great point that this really isn't them embarrassing themselves, because they have a great record right now. This doesn't really damage the record all that much.
No, it doesn't, even if they lose. And that's why it's going to be a win-win, as you noted, because if they win, if they go to 9-2, the train keeps going. The hype continues to build. It's very exciting. But if they lose, look, that's tradition.
Yeah,
so it's fine.
so now you have even a bigger excuse to let the bourbon flow, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
all
for
the
Thanksgiving, watching football, is bourbon still your drink of choice, or will you resort to beer or something like that?
Well, these days I've become a gin guy.
Interesting. I didn't know
Huge
that.
gin guy. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I didn't either until about a year and a half ago.
Wow. Interesting.
And I fell in love with it. It was somewhat random. I was on vacation with my family and was looking at a drink menu, saw something that sounded good. I had never really had it before, and instantly fell in love. It was like watching Adele X Arcopoulos for the first time. You just fall in love immediately. So
It's like, this can exist? Never had this before. That was my reaction when I first had scotch. That was a very eye-opening experience for me.
So gin has become my drink of choice. However, my wife has insisted that this Thanksgiving we are waking up and drinking mimosas. So that's how we will start the day.
Okay. That's not a bad way to start the day.
Doing mimosas. And then probably, knowing my wife and my family, we'll probably move on to wine at some point.
Okay.
As we get to the afternoon.
Red or white?
Oh, we don't do red. I like a good red, but she only drinks white and more exclusively Moscato, because it's really, really sweet.
Yeah, now that I cannot do. Like, I like the drier reds, like a Sauvignon Blanc or something like that. I've always been more of a red guy, but then I've realized that I think my hangovers are less severe with white wine as opposed to red wine, and then maybe it just could be like the density of it that just
Mhm.
dehydrates you more from reds. I'm not really sure.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I like a good red. If you were to come over, I will gladly open a bottle and you and I can down
I would
a
love
good
that.
red.
Yes, if it's a good Pinot Noir, you've got me hooked. I'll be there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we can certainly do that, but she won't do it because the dry sensibilities of a red, she doesn't really love. Like she's just a huge sweet tooth.
It's an acquired
generally.
taste. Yeah, I get that.
And because and like my wife would live off of cheesecake and chocolate ice cream if she could. If she could get away with it, that's all she would ever
How
eat.
ironic that she's also a doctor.
And she's also a doctor. Of course, she eats like a 4-year-old. She understands. She's very aware of this irony.
So then, as far as wines are concerned, does she also like rosés? Because they're usually pretty sweet
No,
too.
because she doesn't. She really just likes the white.
Okay.
But she can't do some of the drier whites either. Like it has to be on the sweet end of the spectrum.
Gotcha. Okay.
So
Okay.
that's all she'll do. And I will indulge, because I can't drink too many glasses of that. Otherwise, it'll certainly make me sick.
Yeah. Same.
But I can
same.
do a glass or two and indulge her in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah. If I'm doing that, then I will have to switch to something rather dry just to offset it a little bit.
But generally, just give me gin and soda and I'm set.
There you
I'm
go.
good.
Yeah.
Good to
My,
go.
my bottle of Woodford is going with me wherever I go now. That's my
There
my
you
drink
go.
of choice. Woodford Reserve, baby.
There you go. At any rate, all of that to say, we hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving, however you celebrate, whatever
Yes.
your drink of choice is.
Yes.
And on this episode, we are going to be talking about the wonderful Alexander Payne, a filmmaker that I am thankful for.
Yes. Same.
I'm a big fan. We talked about this on episode 559, or at least I did. Brendan was gone. He was
Yep.
on his honeymoon.
Yes.
However,
Aruba.
Dave Giannini came on the show and we talked about Alexander Payne, and I'm a big fan. The only film of his that I have not liked is Downsizing. It is an atrocity, but everything else I think has been good to great.
Yeah. Yeah. Downsize. The first 45 minutes. Good short film. I actually think it realizes its concept fairly well at first,
Yeah.
and then it doesn't at all.
Yeah.
I have to respect the ambition. He tried something that he wasn't really able to fully realize, but I give him some credit for that. Fails horribly, but I give him credit for trying.
That's true. He is at least aiming for something.
He's certainly out of his element for sure.
Yes. With the Holdovers, I noted this a few weeks ago. He very much gets back to his wheelhouse, and we'll talk about.
Well, yeah, he kind of
that a
does.
little
We'll talk about that.
Yes. So I'm very thankful for this film and for Alexander Payne in the spirit of Thanksgiving. Let's go ahead and dive into this, Brennan,
Yeah.
shall we? Are you ready?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, let's do this.
Of course. The Holdovers is directed by Alexander Payne, and it stars Paul Giamatti, Dominic Sessa, and Divine Joy Randolph. There are a few others that come and go throughout the film, but it's primarily those three that we'll be talking about here. If you're not familiar with The Holdovers, it is about a cranky history teacher at a remote prep school who is forced to remain on campus over the holidays with a troubled student who has no place to go. All right, Brendan, let's bust out the homework.
Bust out the homework.
D- grades. What did you think about The Holdovers?
Oh, this movie is certainly better than a D-. I'll tell you that. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think only this film, The Holdovers specifically, and Nebraska are the two films that Alexander Payne has done that he didn't co-write.
I think that is correct.
Yeah,
he the cuff here.
He at the very least has a co-writing credit on all of his films, but I know Nebraska was not written by him, and this being written by David Hemmingson, whose work I'm not too familiar with. I know he's mostly tied to television, and I believe The Holdovers was initially conceived as like a television pilot or the basis of a television show that was then morphed into a feature film. I think someone influenced David Hemmingson to morph it into that, and I'm glad he did. I might get a little hot takey here with my opening thoughts.
Before you do, though, sorry,
okay.
I'm going to interrupt right
Yes.
as we get to the peak of the suspense. Did Brendan like this movie or not? But you are correct. I want to emphasize what you're saying there. Nebraska and the Holdovers are the only two he did not write. That is 100% correct.
I thought so. So thank you for checking me on that. But yeah, I might get a little hot takey here. I think this is my favorite movie of the year.
Wow. Okay, we're going right to the top.
Well, I keep thinking about why is that the case? Why did I have such a reaction to this movie that I'm willing to call it my favorite movie of the year so far? Because with that plot synopsis you laid out there, this movie isn't reinventing the wheel at all. It is not doing anything new. In fact, it's wearing its influences very heavily on its sleeve. This is really pulling from those classic dramedies from the 1970s. A lot of critics out there have already acknowledged the influence of Hal Ashby all over this movie.
Sure.
There's even a little bit of nostalgia that maybe you and I have for a movie like this, given our respective upbringing, seeing movies from the 90s, such as maybe something like Dead Poets Society, right?
Sure.
It has that same kind of warmth. And even Alexander Payne has said a movie like Leo McCarey's Make Way for Tomorrow from 1937 was a big influence on the Holdovers. And I could certainly see that for sure. That is one of the saddest movies, certainly of that era. So I keep thinking, like the way that the movie looks, the way it feels, it is very familiar. It's very nostalgic. It's going for that. It's going for that wholesomeness that those movies have, even though Alexander Payne himself has apparently acknowledged that he doesn't really know why the film is getting embraced so warmly and so positively like this, that everyone seems to love it. I think he's not ready to let go of that classic cynicism that usually makes an Alexander Payne film, right? And there is still some of that here in the way that characters.
I think there very much is.
Well, there is a snarkiness to it, right? The way that the characters behave and the way they talk to each other. But this movie does crystallize in a more wholesome way that maybe we haven't really seen from Alexander Payne before. I think maybe I just needed to see a movie like this right now, and it also makes me think, how many movies do we get like this nowadays? I feel like most of the time we're getting a lot of movies now that are certainly more provocative, a little more challenging, maybe not designed to make us feel all that great, that really carry this wholesome energy to them. And that's not to say movies that don't do that are bad. And we still get movies like this nowadays, but I can't think of all that many that do so with this level of success and sincerity. And I think that's why I responded so warmly to this one. I don't think there's really much of a misstep as far as the kind of movie that it's going for. And like I said, it's not doing anything new. It's very much wearing its influences on its sleeve. Like I said, I mean, even the fact that Paul Giamatti is more or less playing Ebenezer Scrooge, right? I mean, that's more or less who he is.
Yeah,
this is very much a Christmas Carol in some ways, but I don't know. I think I needed a movie like this right now. So maybe that's more of a me thing. I really responded positively to this one.
Okay, that's really interesting to hear. I do eventually want to talk about the ending of this film and how that tethers to that potential cynical perspective. I do think this film is still a little cynical, and as heartwarming as it might seem, I don't think it's that black and white. I really don't. And we can certainly talk about that as we go. I will start off my thoughts by echoing Brendan, though. I love this film.
Yeah.
I think it's great. Now, and maybe I will definitely get pushback here. Honestly, it's really not ambiguous. I still think Nebraska is his best film. That to me is Alexander Payne's masterpiece. And again, at the risk of being a little myopic, I don't know if that will ever change for me, because I feel like I'm the only one that champions Nebraska. And
so it feels like your movie, right?
Never wants to let that go.
Yeah. No, that happens, right? When you find yourself being the one that champions something more than others, you hold it closer to your chest, right?
Yes.
And I get that.
Yeah. So I can say comfortably that this is my second favorite Alexander Payne film. It's arguably his best for sure. But I think Nebraska still packs a punch and is also very much in that debate and in that argument. And because no one else will champion it, I will take up that mantle.
Yeah.
Sure. There will be plenty that will likely join Brendan in the Holdovers corner. So give me that guy. Give me Nebraska.
I see. Oh my! I didn't even know you had it up there. Nice
Turd.
work.
Yeah.
Well done. Nice, very sneaky of you, man.
But yes, all of that to say, I still love it. It is my number 2 Payne film
Okay.
at this point. There's a rigorous warmth to this movie, as you're talking about, which is maybe ironic since it all takes place during the winter of the early 70s, and Payne wonderfully takes advantage of the winter aesthetic. But these characters and the way we grow to love them is incredibly warm and poignant. Paul Giamatti gives one of the best performances of his career. The way he tiptoes between teacher, mentor, paternal figure, friend, and even combatant as it relates to Angus, the Dominic Sessa character here. It's nothing short of sublime, while simultaneously he's navigating the truth of his life in terms of educational prowess and legacy, coupled with acceptance that he's gone as far as he can. And I certainly want to talk more about that as we go here. It's a stunning performance in how he taps into the nuances of all of that. And also it's just really entertaining. He's very funny here. His dynamic with Sessa and Divine Joy Randolph is wonderful. Simply a magnetic presence on screen in every frame. Sessa and Randolph are equally great, especially Randolph, who is arguably the MVP. Such a delight, and absolutely loved her in this film as well. Regarding Alexander Payne's direction, and I somewhat alluded to this a moment ago, this is, I think, the best directed film of his. Again, I love what he does with Nebraska. I think it's actually underrated in that regard.
Yeah,
but this is his crown jewel as a filmmaker. For one, this movie is 2 hours and 13 minutes long. It's no Killers of the Flower Moon or Oppenheimer, but it's not short either. And yet this is incredibly smooth in its editing. I never felt its length.
Yeah.
And maybe more noteworthy, I think the editing is quite inspired. This film never holds on to any one moment longer than it needs to. And it has purpose. It is definitely one of his best edited movies. The cinematography here, I think, is actually quite sensational. The period aesthetics and production design are excellent. I love how that is utilized. And as I noted earlier, the film really takes advantage of the winter, that winter aesthetic. It gives this film character in many ways. The music choices are all very good. Everything is executed with flawless precision. It's not a film that screams best cinematography when you compare it to others that are typically nominated in that category. Yeah. But it is really well shot. There are a lot of frames here that you can simply study with how it taps into what these characters are feeling, what they're experiencing, and again, how the editing plays into that. It's all part of the storytelling. Again, this film is really inspired, and it comes through not just in his direction, but in the overall story, the performances, these characters, and again, why at the end of this, we fall in love with them and our hearts break for them at the end.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I do agree with you that the aesthetics here should not be ignored. They are very much pulling from an era of movie making that existed before. I mentioned Hal Ashby and many movies from the 1970s, those dramedies from the 1970s. Even a little bit of Woody Allen kind of feels like it's being sprinkled into this as well. So it is familiar in that regard, but I think a lot of credit has to go to everyone behind the camera, not just Alexander Payne, but to name a few names here, the editing here by Kevin Tent. I do agree with you. It's not even just the smoothness of the overall product and how well paced it is, but the way scene transitions are sometimes managed feel very old school in a way. Yeah. Like the crossfades and the dissolves that are being utilized are really clever. The cinematography here by, I'm probably going to butcher this name, but Edgel Brild, I believe the individual's name is. And what I love about the work going on aesthetically is that it is absolutely pulling from an era that existed before, but it doesn't always feel like it 100% came from that era. There is still a slight contemporary energy to this final product, as if it is bridging those time gaps a little bit, which is weirdly sometimes a tricky thing to do, and to make it feel like it is of its own piece and not pulling from two drastically different timelines. And I do think Alexander Payne, as director and really overseer of all of these things, does a great job meshing all of that together. So I mean, even the opening logos for this movie, it reminds you of a Grindhouse film or something. Sure. I think the Focus Features logo was actually recreated or like newly created for this specific purpose to look like it was a Focus Features film from 1970, which is where this takes place. And you're right, it does take advantage of the Massachusetts snowy landscapes. It's all apparently filmed on location. This is a movie that does not utilize any sets or any green screen or anything like that. It is all very practical, and you do feel that. And even the school that's being the primary focus here, the Barton Academy, as it's called. I don't think it's really called that, but I think it is a real school. It is a real location that they shot at. I think Dominic Sessa was a student at the school that they shot at.
That's part of the story here, is that he did attend one of the schools in which this film was shot. That's how he got the role. Yeah. So it felt organic to this material.
Yeah, and this is his first major film. I think he has done some theater and like a few stage performances here and there, so he at least has experience as a performer and an actor. But
and that's
this is a star-making performance, if you ask me.
It is very good, and it's something that Dave and I talked about again on episode 559, because you look at his films, Alexander Payne's films, and yes, there is a movie star or someone that we do know that is at the center of his films, but that is a Payne attribute. He takes someone that you don't think of for a specific role, and he utilizes the living hell out of it.
Yeah,
and it doesn't Dominic Sessa here, right? But because I immediately, like, when we were having that conversation, the first name that came to mind was Will Forte. You don't think of Will Forte giving a performance like that in Nebraska. That is so counterintuitive to who he is.
Yeah, or what he'll do, what Alexander Payne will do specifically, is that he'll take a legacy actor or actress, but he'll utilize someone that maybe you've temporarily forgotten about, like a June Squibb or someone like that.
June Squibb, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, this even traces all the way back to Sideways. You don't really expect that kind of performance from, let's say, Thomas Hayden Church, for instance. Or, of course, Paul Giamatti. I mean, and maybe he should have won the Oscar for Sideways as well. I think there's an argument to be made for that. He's so great in that movie. But this might be the best performance of his career here in The Holdovers. I don't necessarily disagree with that.
Shailene Woodley wasn't a name when The Descendants.
That's true. Heck, Matthew Lillard was in The Descendants as well. Yeah. One of the killers from the first Scream gives a legitimately good performance in The Descendants.
Yeah. So, like, he loves to do this. He loves to take these either not as well-known actors, or, as you noted, someone that we haven't really thought about in a specific way, such as what we see with Forte and Squibb in Nebraska. Yeah. Certainly actors that people might be aware of, but giving performances that you've never seen him in that context before.
Sure. Yeah.
And I love how he's able to, that's very intentional to him. And
it is.
I agree with you. The performances, it's not just Paul Giamatti. I mentioned him in my opening thoughts, but I agree with you. I think Sessa and how he's able to bring this organic quality to this film, and Divine Joy Randolph, how she taps into the emotion of that character is great. Like these three characters have such a wonderful dynamic. And to me, it is the beating heart of this film, because this movie is all about the unexpected ways that strangers play in our lives, and how sometimes it can even change the trajectory of our path. And I love how that's funneled through these three characters that on the surface have very little in common, aside from being at the same school in this place and time. But underneath, they're all driven by some sort of sadness. With Mary Lamb, it's the unimaginable grief of losing a child. As we find out early on, her son tragically died over in Vietnam. For Angus, he's vividly affected by what happened to his dad.
Yeah.
I'll say vaguely without getting into spoilers. And his mom isn't as attentive to him as he needs, which is very evident in his transparent horror when he finds out that his mom went on a honeymoon over the
Yeah, I
Christmas
know.
holidays,
I
thus
know.
leaving him at the school there alone. And then there's Paul, whose underlying ethos is rooted in a facade he created for himself. And it's so compelling to see how they bond with each other without any of that needing to be conveyed, at
Yeah.
least not in a manufactured schmaltzy kind of way. Mostly the writing here finds a way to make their dynamic and the lessons they learn along the way incredibly organic and warm and compassionate, all while still being very funny and grounded. And the film takes its time. It's not as if Paul and Angus are friends through much of the story. They're not. It's not as if Angus is looking to Paul as a mentor father figure, but
No,
that's
it's
what
anything
makes
but
it-
that. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's what makes it funny when the two of them evoke that idea a couple of times because
Yeah.
they make a mockery of it.
They
such
do.
as the scene when Angus dislocates his shoulder, and oh my
I was
god!
just gonna
I
bring
had
that
an
up.
Out-of-body experience.
I was just
when
going to
I
bring
saw
that up.
at the
You know,
theater.
there's a
I nearly
crucial
killed
moment
you.
there's a crucial moment in this movie that sort of shifts their dynamic a little bit, but it's the right one. You know, it's
Yes.
played in the right way. It's extreme enough to be able to forcefully integrate that new dynamic between them, right?
Absolutely.
And I love that it's built on, of all things, deception. That's
Yeah.
really the thing that kind of brings them together a little bit. For as much as it's told that this academy and this school, it's all about honesty and integrity.
Yeah,
And I love that.
I completely agree. Through most of this film, those two characters really are, if not strangers, they're simply acquaintances that are at odds with each other. But by the end of the film, they start to understand each other in a deeper, more meaningful way. And I love the dichotomy that this relationship opens up Paul to see the truth of how his life ended up where it is, while for Angus, it gives him a vision for where his could go. And for Mary Lamb, she doesn't care to see the past or the future. She just wants to experience this moment as it is, reveling in her grief. But she does take strides thanks to both Paul and Angus. And for all three of them, I think they impeccably exemplify how this unexpected moment where they were forced to spend the holidays together, how they found some sort of truth as a result of that experience.
I love the deliberate choice by either both Alexander Payne and writer David Hemmingson. I'm sure it was a collaborative effort. Maybe it mostly stemmed from David Hemmingson as a screenwriter here. The choice to have these three specific characters be the ones that need to be together for this movie to work. Because you mentioned past, present, and future. In a way, each character kind of represents one of those individual spectrums. But it's the fact that all three of them are at completely different stages of life and age, right?
Yes.
And that's what I think is so interesting about not just the dynamic, but the collective interplay and what the overarching thematic intent of this movie is. Because like the movie itself doesn't really have a huge or big epiphany that is like, oh, like I've never heard a movie do something like this before, right?
Yeah.
But I think if anything, what makes it kind of enlightening and interesting is how all of these three characters have very similar arcs despite being at completely different places in each of their lives. And I think that dynamic is so interesting, and why the interplay between them and the mere casting and character choices to have them all of completely different ages, one being a child, Mary Lamb being, I'm going to guess she's in her 30s. I know Divine Joy Randolph is 37 in real life, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, something to that effect. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have the elderly, the child, and the middle one, and somehow yet all of their arcs feel like they're working in parallel with each other. And that's there's beauty there. I like when movies can not find too much specificity on something, that you have to find a way to morph your life into someone else's, and you find yourself at a distance with it. This is there's such universality to the way that this is handled.
Exactly. I think that's why I was really drawn to that idea of strangers and how they have sometimes this profound effect in our lives. and can change the trajectory of them. And I do think that by the end of this film, some of it in a very literal way, but even internally, all three of them seem to have found a new path because of this experience together.
Yeah.
And as we noted earlier, on the surface, they have nothing in common.
Right.
Their personalities are all very different. And as you noted very astutely,
Yeah.
they all are, they exemplify the different stages of our lives. Yet, I love how underneath all three of them, as I noted, they're all driven by some sort of pathos. And
For sure.
while that doesn't have to be conveyed outwardly, and it really never is, not explicitly, all three of them in their own way do succumb to this level of sadness, but the film doesn't openly throw it at our faces. It's all very organic in how the film taps into it and how these characters eventually bond through it.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
love the warmth in that. I love the compassion in it. And I also love the levity in it. Even as these characters
For sure.
are struggling with this emotional turmoil of some sort, there's still a lot of humor to be had here. And I think that speaks to the natural rhythms of this film and why it feels so organic, because that is how we often treat these circumstances in our lives where, yes, some of it is heavy and you do grapple with the emotions of it, but you also joke and you have fun and you walk around and you steal the school's wine because it's the middle of the night and you have nothing else to do.
Well, you know what I love about the way the movie handles those things is that in any other movie in a poor director and storyteller's hands, those would all be pivot points for movie conflict, right?
Yes.
I think of the prime example when our three leads attend this Christmas Eve party, right?
Yes.
And they have to leave a little bit earlier because Mary has a moment of drunken sadness regarding her dead son, right? And in any other movie, that would have been a problem for the plot to find a resolution for, right? As if it's like it's part of the mechanics of the story. But that's not how this movie treats those things.
Exactly.
Like there's a moment when Angus, his name's Angus, right? Angus Tully. I was blanking on his name for a second, but Dominic Sessa's character, he runs away from his bed in the middle of the night, and Paul has no idea where he is. That's a movie conflict waiting to happen. Turns out, he's just in
Just playing the piano.
the auditorium playing the piano. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. And it's resolved right there. It's
Absolutely.
I love that.
I completely agree. And to me, I love how the film subverts conflict in that way. And also circling back to the underlying emotion in all of these characters, there are parallels, but I do love how the film doesn't treat that as conflict as you're talking about, because in another movie, that moment at the Christmas party with how it ends and Mary Lamb having that moment where she succumbs to her grief, I'll say. Another movie would have used that to then draw the parallel outwardly to, let's say, Angus and the emotion
it would become this obstacle for the movie to resolve or something.
Well, I not even just the obstacle of it or the conflict of it, but them having a conversation and Angus going, well, I can relate because I'm also, struggling with emotion too.
Okay.
And then they bond over
use that as a way to
obvious schmaltzy moment
to very
together.
Literally tie them together thematically. And the movie does not
and
do
this
that.
film avoids that very deliberately. Like, I love that moment simply crystallizes with Mary Lamb, having her moment of grief. But again, to the duality of tones here, it ends in this really amusing, poignant, but compassionate levity, right?
Yeah.
Where she makes a joke about, like, she says something to Paul about, like, just shut up and let's go home, or whatever. Like it ends in this moment of levity that works for this film, and it doesn't draw conflict. It doesn't draw an unnecessary parallel to the other characters, because this film gives time for us to learn and understand the pathos that's driving Angus separately from that moment with Mary Lamb. Like they each have their moment. So the parallels are brought up in a much more natural way that allows the viewer to pinpoint those parallels without the film overtly just throwing them in your face. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
That's what I love about the writing here.
Well, yeah, and it makes me even appreciate the shoulder dislocation scene even further, as if it's meant to be kind of a sleight of hand. Because, like, that's the one moment of physical conflict and obstacle that the movie has to overcome. So when these other potential obstacles start making their way into the movie, your first thought is, oh, something big is going to happen again, isn't it? And it doesn't really do that. So it's almost as if that scene is maybe inadvertently setting the audience up to have the rug pulled from under them. And the rug being pulled is the fact that the rug doesn't get pulled. It's like, I kind of love the way that it plays with tension in that regard.
Absolutely. And a moment like that, such as dislocating your shoulder, and the way Paul and Angus resolve it, it gives space again for their specific dynamics to collide in a way that makes sense. That wouldn't be contrived or emotionally manipulative. And of course, there's still fun to be had in that sequence when they're talking about, hey, let's stage this moment as father and son. And so the film gets to have its cake and eat it too, in the sense that emotionally speaking, you do see the pathos of them separately come together, but there's also some great levity there, and also trauma for me. Because that moment, it's one thing that he dislocates his shoulder. Now, I didn't dislocate my shoulder, but I've dislocated my knee 5 times, 6 times.
You've dislocated something. And the way you've described it,
it's awful.
It's not pleasant. It's not pleasant.
Awful. And the first time was exactly how we see it here, except I rode in an ambulance. No one drove me. But yes, you go to the hospital and you're laying there waiting for them to put it back into place. And the screaming and the agony he shows here, I actually think he handled it well. I believe I was much worse. I was screaming my head off. It is the worst pain I have ever felt. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy.
Gosh.
But so I was having flashbacks and like night terror sweats when that scene was unfolding.
Thankfully, it's not that long, but I mean, it's pretty visceral.
It's a great moment. I actually love the scene despite that. I'm obviously being playful with it, but it is a great moment that is actually pivotal to this film. And to your point earlier, it does plant the seed of that relationship between Paul and Angus to eventually shift. And, where they've been mostly combatants to that point, they start to, it's where they're finally starting to see and understand each other a little bit.
Yeah.
Something that compounds on itself once they get to Boston, and there's a lot there that unfolds that's really great. But in terms of the writing and this fundamental ideal of strangers and how they play a part in our lives in these very unexpected ways, this film evokes that impeccably.
Oh, yeah, and that sense of lostness that you can feel at any age is really the film's biggest draw that I find so powerful. And part of why it's so powerful too, and this is just the power of movies like this, it's the sense of humor. Sometimes the most enlightening form of communication is to just make someone laugh simultaneously, right? This is a very funny movie.
Very funny.
It really, and this is where I think the Alexander Payne isms that we know and love do make their way into this final product. Every scene has at least one very cynically and bitingly funny line of dialogue, or at least a funny exchange. One of my favorites being really this whole trip to Boston that Angus and Paul go on together. And there's a moment where Paul runs into someone he knows from his Harvard past. Right?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, and it's not just the exchange that they have, it's the scene in the liquor store afterwards, where Paul's backstory on how he knows this man, how he chose to lie in the first place in that moment, or why he chose to lie in the first place. It involves him accidentally hitting someone with his car, as he reveals, which is why he's in the place that he is. And the clerk at the store just says, "Here you go, killer." And like when he gives him his change, it's like that may have been the moment that made me laugh the most. But it's little moments like that. This is going to make this movie so rewatchable for me.
I love that as well. And that is a great transition, Brendan, because I do want to talk further about Paul. And that moment you bring up is absolutely crucial to this film. What I love about Paul, so much that I love about Paul, but in those opening scenes, we quickly find out that he's disliked by all the students and the staff at the school.
Yeah.
Partially because he insists on handing out failing grades and making things as cumbersome as possible for the students, and then chastising them for the slightest transgressions. He's without question overly belligerent with the little power he has, something that the film deconstructs as it goes. But despite where it comes from, he likes to hold his intellectual prowess over people, including his own boss, the Dr. Hardy Woodruff character. There's a scene early on where Paul is being told that he's going to be in charge of the holdovers over the holidays.
Yeah.
And in this conversation, he references some classic author. And when his boss guesses the author correctly, he smiles and nods in pride like he would one of his students getting something right in the classroom.
Yeah.
Which, if you're Woodruff, if you're his boss, that absolutely is going to come off as condescending.
Oh, absolutely.
So, like, there's no ambiguity as to why people find him insufferable, but that's not the only reason he's so disassociated from everyone around him. Generally, he's just not very sociable, something that he's aware of, that he talks about a couple of times throughout the film. And in a way, it kind of empowers his presumptuous sensibilities. But over the course of the film, we slowly learn more about him and why he ticks the way he does.
Yeah.
Especially once we move away from the school. And as you noted, they take this trip to Boston, and there comes a few moments there where we come to understand that Paul sees himself the way he does because it's what keeps him from perhaps being ashamed of what he's really accomplished when compared to his peers and classmates. So by putting himself on a pedestal, it undermines whatever disappointment he might feel. And I think that context adds great poignancy to not only Paul, but the choices he makes. And Giamatti's performance and all of that is incredible.
Oh, absolutely.
I absolutely agree with you about the humor. Again, the tonal variances of this film are great. The conversation he has with his former college classmate there, it's funny in the moment. The convenience store that depicts the aftermath, I agree, is also very funny.
Yeah.
But in terms of what it tells us about Paul, incredible stuff there. It enlightens us to a whole new world that shows that makes Paul all the more transparent.
I agree. And what I think is so interesting about the film, and this is perhaps where the film is at its most nuanced or complex, especially for a film like this that ultimately could be viewed as rather easy, which is not a bad thing. But it's the dissection of Paul as a character and how he views others that is rather complex, because he's constantly blaming not just the children at this school, but also those he works for at the Barton Academy of being entitled. The sense of entitlement is something he very much says all the time, but you are kind of on his side at first, because we do see this, I guess, perception of entitlement all over this school. It's even all over the educators' lunch table, right? Like, you get that sense too, the fact that they're all white educators. Like, that's actually something that's kind of cryptically addressed in this movie that I also want to acknowledge a little bit later as well, as it relates to Mary.
Cynicism. It's there.
See, that's there. It is there. You're not wrong. You're not wrong. And so we are absolutely on Paul's side, but it's also very good. The film is also very good, rather, at showing those things as if it's only from Paul's perspective, because then we kind of recognize that maybe he's using that term entitlement, as truthful as it could be. It's really just more of a weapon to mask his own insecurities, and perhaps using that to blame others for his own failings and not owning up to his own mistakes along the way. And I think that's a pretty wise way to balance those extremes without saying Paul is right or wrong. He's both. He's absolutely both.
I agree. I mean, you look at those scenes early on before we get that context there with those scenes in Boston, and he talks about this book that he wants to write, but it's this half-baked idea. And this would be something that would legitimize him as an educator and professor, something that is never materialized because either he's just too disappointed when he looks at himself in the mirror, or maybe he's just accepted that this is his life and writing a book is overly ambitious for him. Either way, I love that duality in Paul. And early on, it just comes off as him showcasing perhaps some faux insecurity, or not insecurity, but rather some faux pride maybe.
Yeah.
And, like he has this idea, he thinks that maybe this could be something of value. But when we get to Boston and we find out what really happened to him, I think part of the reason he doesn't want to write that book is that he is ashamed that this is all his life has been up to this point. And also, to your point about the insecurity there, I don't know if he believes he could write it in a way that would legitimize him. And it would probably just bring further embarrassment, especially when his peers find out where he actually works. And I think that's something he kind of doesn't want out in the public. And the film doesn't overtly tell us these things. I love the subtlety in it, but all the clues are there for us to infer that he is disappointed on some level, insecure for sure. And those things become the root of why he takes this little power that he has, as small and insignificant as it is, to hold it over everyone at this school, staff and students alike.
Yeah.
And then by the end of the film and his relationship with Angus, it's interesting to see how that is deconstructed and then further subverted by a choice that he makes in those final scenes, which I think is really great. And definitely shows how, again, acquaintance, call him a stranger, however you want to define that relationship, but Angus does something to Paul that it takes some time to get there. There's a lot of combativeness, but that choice he makes at the end, as it's heartwarming, and the film very much earns it.
Not only does it earn it, it crystallizes itself in a way that feels still somewhat surprising, because what Payne and Hemmingson do so well here is they give us this climax, this confrontation that happens in what it's essentially the principal's office involving Angus's parents, right? I'll just simply say that. You kind of know what's going to happen in a high level way, what's going to happen in that scene, right? But what the film does a really good job and smartly does is it crystallizes that moment by acknowledging a joke from way earlier in the film.
Yes.
Right. So I love the little touches like that. It's a script that's written using only dialogue. It's not a script about story or plot. Like, those are the worst kind of scripts. This is just about character exchanges. It almost reads like a novel. Like, I feel like if I were to read this on the page, it would feel almost like a short story or something like that.
Yeah.
Like a Christmas novel or something like that. This very much is a Christmas movie, and I could see this becoming a staple in many households, especially for those who maybe grew up in the 1970s and saw those movies by Hal Ashby that this movie is certainly pulling from. It's going to be even more nostalgic for those families as well. So I could see it becoming a staple in that regard, but just from a writing standpoint, using only dialogue to convey those things. So it gets us to think about it rather than, simply be told it. And I love that.
I agree. I love that as well. And regarding that ending and that choice that Paul makes there, it's twofold. It works because of Paul, how the film writes him, and Giamatti's performance. But as great as that is, it does not work if we do not care about Angus.
Right.
That also has to be huge here. So I do want to talk about Angus and why I think he's so great in this film, and ultimately why that ending works so great. Earlier, we noted that his dad isn't around. His mom isn't very attentive. So throughout the film, his loneliness and sorrow, it's not only there in the character, but it manifests itself in these rebellious outbursts.
Yeah.
But mostly we see it when his isolation is highlighted in some sort of way. Like when one of the students steals a photo of him and his parents, which is some sort of memento that clearly means something to him.
Yeah.
Or when Paul denies him things at school that would remedy his boredom, or when Paul initially says no to the Christmas party and Angus hilariously throws a brownie at a wall. When he's given a sense of community, he's actually very endearing.
Yeah.
I think of the moment when he comforts the Yee-Jun Park character when he was having a nightmare.
Yeah.
Or
It's a good moment.
the fun he does have at the Christmas party when he connects with this other girl that's there. There's one of the best scenes of the film is this Christmas dinner scene that all three have together, where he talks about how nice it actually is, especially given the circumstances, the camaraderie, the sense of family that's there.
And the way it crystallizes with that dessert.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, God, what a gag. What a great gag.
Absolutely love it. Maybe it's a little cliche, but I think there's
who
something
cares?
very relatable about how his loneliness, especially as a teenager, is so inescapable and how it leads to this volatility. And that is the case for Angus. He's angry. He's heartbroken. He feels betrayed on some level, and he takes it out on other people. But when he's given love, it's almost a completely different human being. And you find him so endearing and funny. And the way the film examines that and breaks that down, then to build it up through that dynamic he has with Paul. And while we haven't got into some of the specifics there in Boston, which I guess we should avoid for spoilers, but there's a couple of things that happen where I guess there are some significant things that happen, but some of the minor things are them going through the museum. You mentioned the moment where Paul runs into his former classmate. The one detail about that scene that I do want to reveal here, maybe this is a spoiler, so I guess fair warning, but I think it's really fun. He brings up this idea that he has this book that he wants to write, as I noted. And from Paul's perspective, it's not something he wants to do. We talked about that. However, in this moment, Angus, completely makes up the content of the book.
Yeah.
Which
like
is not
historic
based in any
cameras
sort
or
of
something like
reality.
that.
It's something he just completely makes up. And so they go along with the gag similarly to what we saw earlier with the dislocated shoulder having to pretend to be father and son. In this moment, it's similarly, except I think Angus is pretending to be a nephew, I believe.
Yes, a nephew.
So there's this faux family dynamic at play, but they had built up this bond and chemistry enough that we're in on the joke with them. We're having fun. We see it, and you see them bond further with that, which compiles on itself in the next moment, as you talked about, as funny as the gag is in the convenience store.
Killer.
Yeah. But the context of that conversation, it not only gives us more insight into Paul, but it does Angus as well. Something that they're able to connect over.
Yeah.
And then it leads to some choices that Angus makes as it relates to his own loneliness. And so, again, you start to see the pendulum swing back and forth in this organic way between where is Paul in his life, what's at the root of his facade, and then in this next moment, it's about Angus and his, and you're seeing these two characters and the root that's driving both of them just colliding these fascinating
You see
ways.
it interlock. Yeah.
You see it interlock, absolutely. And so by the end of the film, you are so endeared to both of them that when Paul makes that choice, yes, it works because we love Paul, but we equally love Angus. And the film doesn't work without both of those things.
No, I could have watched their dynamic for
Another
even more
2.5
hours. And not even just the two of them. I mean, also including Mary Lamb, Divine Joy
She's
Randolph.
so
I
great
think,
here. I
Yeah,
love
the three
her.
of them. I have one more thing to say about her that I think is really fascinating. But just an overarching comment I have about what you're saying, and this is perhaps why I responded so positively to this movie. And the more we talk about it, the more I'm probably able to find words to, I guess, explain why I loved it so much. Because, like, you mentioned a word there that I do somewhat agree with is cliche. Like, in many ways, this movie is cliched. It's kind of littered with cliches. But in a way, I think it's way more difficult to be able to navigate those cliches and to make you as an audience member not even think about the cliches. Like that is That's almost more difficult than anything surprising that something like Oppenheimer does, right? Right?
Well, I think Payne and the writing here, I do agree with you that it evokes these cliches, but in its execution subverts them.
And that's a difficult thing to do. I mean, it's easy to latch on to the what of all of this, because it is so familiar. Like, this is very familiar. But the fact that you're not thinking of the familiarity of it all while watching it is a really tricky line to navigate. And I do think Payne handles that very well.
I agree. I think that familiarity is really more on the surface and how we've seen these characters that you might consider outcasts in some sort of way come together and find some sort of relatability. But there are so many movies that I love where if you wanted to simply talk about its surface level choices that evokes trite cliches, it really means nothing to me. And I think that's why we've argued forever on this show. I don't care what a film is about. How is it in execution?
Exactly. That's the thing. Like, a movie can be cliched, but a movie can also be cliched without being trite. And I think that's the case of what's going on here.
I agree. And I do think the film is aware of its tropes and goes out of its way to subvert them in execution for all of these nuances we're talking about, and how it has a lot of fun, but it doesn't forego the humanity of these characters, and how it, taps into these three different, not only very different characters, but as you noted earlier, different stages of life, and how we all seemingly grapple with loneliness and sadness in some sort of way. But again, it's never really about like lingering in that sadness.
Yeah.
And there's a time and place for that. After Sun is a film that I
absolutely
will love forever. That is all about lingering in that sadness.
The grief is a character in that movie.
Exactly. There's a time and a place for it. And Alexander Payne doesn't want that to be the
he
case
wants
here.
to be about the people. So anything they're feeling and experiencing is not necessarily secondary, but it's not the driving focus here. And the same could be said about, let's say we go back to Mary Lamb, for instance, and something that I think is kind of fascinating about the movie is how aware it is that it takes place during the Vietnam War, 1969 into 1970, when, to be fair, to put it bluntly, racism still existed, right? This movie isn't about racial dynamics or anything like that, but it is sensed throughout the film. It very much
there.
is. Yeah, it's there. And there's even a comment made regarding as to why Mary Lamb's son, as smart and good of a kid as he was, why he was chosen to go to Vietnam War.
Where most kids from that school never go that route, they say.
The movie doesn't come out and say, oh, it's because he was black. But it's kind of cryptically hidden in the shadows, right? So I think the way it's inferred and the quietness of it all is something that the film is really good at handling. I think that's actually one of its greatest strengths, the fact that it is so calm about all of those things.
Yeah, I completely agree. And as it relates to those tones that we were talking about, lingering in sadness, I think Mary Lamb is quintessential to that, right? Because this is a character that is going through what I would imagine is the worst pain any human can experience.
Oh, for sure.
And that gives her the excuse to linger in that grief, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it could, she could have been the Paul Mescal of this movie, but that's not the case. It really isn't the case. There are moments where we see that grief come to the surface for sure. And Randolph is incredible in how she taps into it. But the character from like a scene to scene basis isn't wallowing in overt sadness. She's often funny or she's, joining in on the camaraderie with Paul and Angus as well. She's cracking her own jokes. Even and I mentioned the Christmas party sequence where we do see her wallow in that grief in a very strong way that's moving, but it ends with her cracking a joke at Paul.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that's how it ends. And that is the character throughout the film. And to me, that is exemplary to what we were talking about earlier in terms of how this film wants to depict humanity in a way that isn't singular, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where in one moment we might be feeling isolated because our mom is on a honeymoon instead of being at Christmas with us. Or maybe in one moment we're feeling disappointed because I had to drop out of Harvard,
Yeah.
you know, or my son died. Like those moments are here, but it's not who we are.
It's not.
Moment to moment.
No.
And you know, we might be feeling that sense of sadness in this moment, and 5 minutes later, we might be laughing with our friends.
Absolutely.
Like,
Well,
that's how we live our lives.
the idea of found family coming from the most unexpected places is certainly here, which makes me think, you know what this almost is? This is almost an English-speaking Hirokazu Koreeda film.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
In
mean,
a lot of ways, it is.
yeah, thematically speaking,
Yeah.
at least.
I want to see the opposite trend.
I do,
where
yeah.
Koreeda remakes this movie.
Yeah. I want to see that. Yeah, let's see foreign directors remake American films instead. I would like
Yeah.
to see that trend.
Absolutely. I think that would be really fun to see. But that's a really astute point. This is a Koreeda film, but in an American context.
with Payne cynicism.
Yeah. Like if
Yeah.
you told me that Alexander Payne, like this is based off of a Koreeda movie that he remade, I would believe it. I would absolutely believe it.
Me too. Yeah.
It's certainly funnier. Like Koreeda's films aren't overtly humorous a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Payne could take the bare bones of the story, which is Koreeda, and do it in a Payne way that's funny.
For sure.
I still think that's a very, very astute observation there. Do you have any final thoughts on the Holdovers?
I guess one last final thought. What did you think about the fact that this movie essentially opens having multiple kids being held over before they're just kind of whisked away? Because if there's one thing I have a question about, and it's not really a flaw, was it really necessary to have 3 or 4 kids in addition to Angus at first, before they're literally conveniently whisked away out of the movie? And it's kind of twofold, because I actually like the dynamic between all the kids together. It was a movie I could have seen all on its own.
Mm-hmm.
So the sudden narrative shift to have them out of the movie it's not necessarily a problem. It's just the one moment where I thought, I wonder what the reason for that choice was.
Yeah, I love it. I think it actually is necessary here. Maybe least notable, I think it's just interesting from a world building perspective.
Okay.
The idea that on the holidays, over the Christmas holidays, every year seemingly there are at least several kids that are held over.
That's a good point. So that maybe adds to the Payne cynicism that we talk about, that we actually realize it's not just one kid that's left held over because his parents don't. It's actually several, and some of them are even on the younger side. Like there are 2 kids that are like maybe 9 or 10 years old.
10 years old, something to that effect. Yeah.
I think they're 11 is what they said, but they're certainly a lot younger than Angus is, for instance.
An idea that I do think is elevated because it's Christmas. You see kids at school over Christmas, and there's something about that idea that just registers poignantly, because kids should be at home celebrating Christmas and opening gifts. That's at least what we want for them. So the fact that they're stuck at school, and not only stuck at school, but with Paul, who doesn't know anything else other than to have his strict guidelines, give them homework. We're going to the library. Like the routines of it, I think are interesting. To me, I think it gives us insight into Paul as well. The fact that he continues to be this strict ruler who is going to show his power over them any chance he can, because that's who he is. To me, it's building up the facade of Paul that the film eventually breaks down when we realize that it is a facade because of the context that we find out. So I do think it's important from that perspective.
That's a good point.
And as I noted earlier, I think it's important for Angus as well, because of the student dynamic. I mentioned the moment when one of the students steals the photo from
Yeah.
him and we see his reaction. I think that tells us a lot about his loneliness there. The moment he has with Yejun Park when he has the nightmare, it shows
Yeah.
us the other side of that coin, that he's not
Yeah.
just this,
That's a good scene.
you
Yeah.
know,
That's
cynical.
foreshadowing in some ways. So
It's
I like
foreshadowing
that.
as well. So I do think all of that is effective. And then once they leave and they still can't get a hold of his mom, she's still absent, forcing him to be the only one of the 7 or 8 of them that are there. It just emphasizes that loneliness that he's feeling.
Yeah.
And the
And
sorrow
that's a good point.
that it eventually manifests itself as more rebellious behavior. So I do find it all very important, actually.
Yeah, and like I said, I didn't bring it up as a criticism. It was more of a, I wonder what the choice was from a narrative standpoint as to, arc it that way.
Yeah.
But what you say makes a lot of sense, and I certainly sense that for sure. Yeah, I still think this might be my favorite movie of the year, and it's really difficult to say that because of how great some of these other achievements of the year have been, like Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. I mentioned that earlier. Like the achievement that movie cannot be ignored. The thing with the Holdovers is that it just made me realize how difficult it is to make a movie like this as well. Like it seems easy and it seems simple, but to do something with this kind of blend of cynicism and wholesomeness, that is not an easy thing to do. And to
Yeah.
somehow bridge the gap aesthetically, to harken back to those influences, but still make something that feels rather contemporary, it made me realize that I don't think we see enough of these kind of movies as much as I would like. At least we always get a few of them a year, but I think we always see them with varying degrees of success. But here, this is as perfect as I think they can get as far as this type of movie is concerned, and I'm
Yeah.
glad. I'm glad we're able to still see movies like this. I think that's why I was so warm to it after coming out of it for the first time.
Yeah, no, I agree. I love the warmth of this film. And as I noted earlier, I love how this film is examining this idea of strangers, these 3 outcasts of sorts coming together
Yeah,
and forming a bond, a pseudo family, if you will. And where that leads in the end, I want to end my thoughts here because there's a couple of scenes, moments, images where we leave these characters that have embedded itself deep into my brain. I think of that final moment we get with Mary Lamb where she's at her sister's. There's a shot of her opening up this box, and it's something that is on its face devastating and
Yeah.
heartbreaking. But I love how Alexander Payne treats this, again, circling back to his direction and his sense of control here, and the editing, the way it's shot, the way it's edited, how we see her open the box. There's a close up to her. And as heartbreaking as it is, as she opens this up and it's a reminder of her son, Alexander Payne is bringing a profound sense of humanity to this moment. Again, it's
Yeah.
not about the grief. It's not about the sadness of it, as much as it seems to be implying that Mary Lamb is on her way to finding closure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love that. I love that it leaves us in this space that there is hope for her still, even though she's not necessarily looking forward. She's not looking back. She's just staying in this moment. And I think it like leaves us in this space where there is hope, and it just wallows in that foreshadowing, then reveling with the character,
Yeah,
which
for
I
sure.
love. With Angus, there's a couple of moments in Boston that we've avoided for spoiler reasons, and I don't want to give it away, but there are a couple of choices he makes there that I do find heartbreaking for him. There's a gesture that he makes. There's an exchange with another character that emphasizes that loneliness. We see something that is, I guess, it's heartbreaking in a lot of ways, and
Yeah.
I love that the film is willing to go there to show us why he feels the way he does, because it does add weight to the choice that Paul makes in the end, because it has a lot to do with that moment of Angus and Boston.
Sure.
I know
yeah.
I'm saying this as vaguely as possible, but
This will definitely be helpful for those who have seen the movie.
yes. But when you see this character that Angus runs into, it adds a level of heartbreak. But because of that moment, it leads to this series of conflict that we get at the end regarding Paul and this sacrifice that he makes. And how the film builds to it. We've talked a lot about, from a character perspective, why it's so effective. But I also want to note at the Alexander Payne cynicism, because I do think that it is very much in the Paul character. You mentioned it earlier. The world around him is changing and he can't keep up.
Yeah.
And he speaks to this a couple of different times. It's part of why he sees the younger generation the way he does. And, the culture, the way it's shifting, he just doesn't see eye to eye with it. History and his reverence for history doesn't seem to be a priority at all. And that comes through in these outbursts in Paul throughout the film, that the film mostly plays as levity.
Yeah.
And Paul Giamatti is so great at tapping into it. It really is funny how that comes through. Like, I love those moments when Mary Lamb is watching some dating show. I forget which one it was.
The Newlywed Game.
The Newlyweds. And he has no clue what any of this is. And he clearly doesn't care. He sees it as very superficial. But it's funny to see his response to it, right?
It is. Yeah. Yeah.
But even when it comes to education and this intellectual prowess that he embodies throughout the film, he thinks of himself as living in this presumptuous higher stratosphere.
Yeah.
That again, the film ironically deconstructs or pulls the rug out from under him a little bit. But
yeah,
I love
and very visually suggests that he's just someone that's not seeing straight. We haven't even mentioned his eye.
Yeah, his eye. He literally doesn't see straight. Right? It's off kilter.
Yeah.
And that's another gag in this film.
That was so effective, because at first it made me think, wow, I haven't seen Paul Giamatti in a long time. Is that real? But I guess, it is just, written for the movie.
Yeah. And the film does a great job of utilizing that for humor, but symbolically, absolutely. I think it taps into Paul and how uneven he sees the world, how he fits into the world. I think all of that is wonderfully symbolic. And I do think it has a level of cynicism to it until we get to the end and Paul is able to subvert that in a way that I think is great. So, like, as heartwarming as this film is, I don't know if it ends on a note that is wholly heartwarming, because this choice that Paul makes, while for himself it might be pulling the rug out from the cynicism we had seen from him earlier, but outwardly, from a broader perspective, it only heightens the cynicism that the film had brought up earlier.
Well, yeah, because
the truth of what happened is not relevant to the choices that are made in the end.
Well, yeah, because we don't necessarily know that Paul is going to end up at a better place in life by the end of the movie.
It could very much be worse for all.
We could at least argue, did he become a better person? Yeah,
yes.
Maybe. But does that
probably
necessarily mean he's going to find more literal, physical fulfillment in life? No. I mean,
probably not.
It's entirely possible he ends up even more depressed if things don't go his way.
Yeah, and we know based on what we saw earlier that he's an alcoholic or borderline an alcoholic. Yeah. He's drinking whiskey at 10 o'clock in the morning, something the kids joke about at one point.
Yeah.
And also he notes that he essentially lives at the school. There's a moment with another character. I think it was with Mary Lamb. He tells her he's, like, she jokes that he never leaves the school. And he's like, yeah, I go into town to get groceries and stuff.
I think it was either with her or with the Lydia Crane character played by Carrie Preston. I think it was with Mary Lamb, though.
Okay. Either way, he notes that he barely leaves the school. And when he does, he only goes into town to get groceries. Other than that, he's at the school all the time. It is his life. It is his home. And when you couple that with the context of what we learn with him in Boston and how he essentially failed school, and this was the only job he could get, and even that was someone taking pity on him or seeing something in him. It wasn't something that he had earned.
Yeah.
This was all that he had, and it's very possible that he wasn't going to get back to anything like that. At least the film lingers on that ambiguity. So, yeah, I mean, I think in a way it subverts the cynicism while simultaneously
leaning into it. Yeah. No, that's a great point. Honestly, and it does make me appreciate the movie even more than I already do, because there is this obvious like sensation of a warm hug happening at the end of the movie, right? But if someone did choose to argue that that was kind of a facade by the end, all right, now I'm starting to see that a little bit, or at least there is room for that potential viewpoint.
I mean, I think that embrace at the end is incredibly endearing.
Oh yeah,
I think that on its own terms is warm and striking, but I do think simultaneously when you break down the context of the what and how we got there, I do think there's a level of uncertainty for sure.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point.
Absolutely. So I do think Payne gets to have his cake and eat it too.
Hey, good movie. Great movie.
Yes.
This is a movie I think everyone needs to see. I really do.
It is one of the best of the year. I don't know where it ranks for me. It might not be number one like it is for Brendan, but I really love it.
Okay, yeah. Do I think a movie like Oppenheimer, for instance, is a better movie? Yes. Like, there's no denying the craft of that one. I don't know how Nolan was able to do what he did with that thing.
Yeah.
But I'm going to watch this one way more often. I'll just say that.
I think that's fair.
That's the beauty of our year-end top 10 list, right? Is that these are our favorites.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're still among the best. But we kind of shuffle them and order them as they are our own list. And that's what makes a critic's list by the end of each year so much fun, because we're not looking at them in the same way. So I love this movie.
No one's going to blame you. Like I have had favorites in my top 10 forever.
You've had a Midnight Special at number 1 before.
I've had Midnight Special there.
Which, to be fair, is still a great movie. So it's not to knock the objectivity of that one.
Absolutely. Or, I think of maybe even more notably our original top 10 list for 2007, where I had Once at number 1. Now, if I was going to talk about the best movies of that year, for sure, it's There Will Be Blood, it's No Country, it's Zodiac. Yeah. For sure, among many others. It's a deep year.
Yeah.
But Once is absolutely one of my very favorites, if not my favorite movie of that year.
Well, and I think
still being objectively worthy of being in that conversation.
And I think that's why doing top 10 lists at the end of each year like that are more interesting. And it's not to say that they should be more interesting in that way, like you're trying to purposely shuffle it just to be a bit against the grain or anything like that.
Yeah.
But I find like my favorite movie of 2016 was Richard Linklater's Everybody Wants Some.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that was genuinely my favorite movie of that year. Yeah. That same year, was La La Land a better crafted film than Everybody Wants Some? Yes, it absolutely was. But Everybody Wants Some just struck a certain chord with me that other movies didn't. So like that's what makes these things fun.
Absolutely. And I think The Holdovers is a movie that you'll see it's going to be on a lot of top 10 lists.
Well, sure. You're going to see a lot of, at least I hope you see a lot of love for it from the Academy, which is why I'm kind of devastated that a week from now, as we're recording this, the film is going to be released digitally already. That's just ridiculous. That's ridiculous.
It's devastating. I don't know what its box office has been. Maybe I can look that up. I don't know if that's what's motivating this. Maybe they feel more people will see it if it's streaming throughout the holidays instead of going to the theater. It's hard to say.
Maybe.
But this has the type of formula that I feel like would do very well at the box office if it was marketed properly.
Yeah.
Has there been any marketing for this movie?
Very little.
In fact, little, right?
I mean, I didn't even see a trailer before going to see it. I just knew of its existence, and I did go back and watch the trailer after seeing the film, and it's actually a pretty charming trailer. Like, I could see that marketing working for families who want to go to the movies over the holiday season.
All right, so I'm looking at the box office now, and
It looks like just like 9.1 million or something like that.
It's not great, but how many theaters though?
Not many, apparently.
1,600 theaters. So
I don't think that's a lot.
it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not super small, but it's not wide either.
Yeah.
So it's like kind of there in the middle.
Yeah.
But definitely on the smaller end for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe they see the 9 million where the trajectory is just not great.
But you're right. Maybe they being focused features, they believe that this will do well on streaming platforms and just on VOD, where maybe that's where its target audience is. And
maybe
if it does garner an audience that there is some legs for it, then they can, re-release it in theaters over the holiday season as sort of like a precursor to Oscar season, right?
Yeah. And I do think that if it does get Oscar nominations, it'll get some sort of limited theatrical run.
It will, yeah. I don't know about Best Picture. I think it'll at least get nominated. I don't know if I would call it the front runner just yet, but I think we can at least assume Paul Giamatti is getting in for Best Actor.
I was going to say, after missing for Sideways, surely the Academy will make up for that. And it's a deserved performance. It's not as if this is some sort of makeup Oscar nomination of some sort.
No,
it's
very well earned. Yeah. You're right. This is not The Departed.
So he's genuinely one of the best male performances of the year.
I agree.
But I think the writing is good enough. I think the film is good enough for Best Picture.
I agree.
That might be a stretch. We'll see what the Academy does, but it should be in the conversation for sure.
Yeah, it's a great movie.
At any rate, that'll do it for this review. Let us know if you agree or disagree with anything that we had to say. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. You can hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below. What did you think of this film? If you agree or disagree, be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, all that fun stuff. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, please leave us reviews. It really helps out the show if you could do that. And I think that'll be it. Am I missing anything, Brendan?
I think that's it, JD. I think we got it.
I think we got it. We recorded this on the day before Thanksgiving. It is being released on Thanksgiving, as we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It is unfortunate, the timing of it, because it's a Christmas movie, as Brendan noted. We should have done this in another 22 days, 3 days.
Well, I could see why Focus wanted to get it out before that. But at the same time, the timing is a little awkward for sure.
We did it on the wrong holiday.
But hey, you're the one that dresses up for Christmas before Thanksgiving even occurs, so it actually fits your bill, I guess.
That's true. I'm already in the Christmas spirit, but
so there you go.
So it works great for me, but maybe not for everyone else.
And I was the
Brendans of the world.
I was the Scrooge on that episode that said I hate when people decorate their houses and stuff for Christmas even before Thanksgiving even occurs, and here I am praising a Christmas movie before Thanksgiving has even occurred.
Yeah.
So I'm a bona fide hypocrite. I'm a bona fide Scrooge. I know it.
Yeah. Great movie though. I do love it, and I think it's definitely a movies that people should watch through the holidays for sure.
Absolutely.
It's really great. At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, Paul Giamatti. So good.
I miss the man.
So good.